Hello, welcome to Thursday. Unfortunately, there is no tea time with Kelly today as she is still feeling under the weather from her procedure last week. Today I thought I would spend a little time talking about one of my most requested topics, which is the royal space on Tumblr that I was a part of for many years. I think it's an interesting topic because it lays some foundation and history of trends that would later become very apparent with the introduction of Harry and Meghan as a couple. Unfortunately, I don't have any screenshots, so this is all hearsay and my own recollection. Although, most things on the internet are also hearsay, so take it as you will. I went over a lot of this in my intro video, but just to recap, I joined Tumblr, which was mostly used as a photo meme sharing space back in 2011 after the Cambridges got married. I had a dorm floor friend who was obsessed with anything British. She also introduced me to Doctor Who, and eventually moved overseas and now lives there with her British husband, but anyway. I have a very fond memory of a group of girls sitting around a TV that looked like it was from 1995, watching and waiting to see Kate in her dress as it got later, or I guess earlier, Pacific Standard Time. And that kind of started my interest. Before then, I had a very basic knowledge of the royal family. Basically, I was snagged by a photo on Tumblr and ended up in this space, which at its peak, again, in the few years after the wedding, seemed to have hundreds if not thousands of active users posting and commenting. So I would like to preface this section with that we didn't know what we know now, especially not on Tumblr. All the breakups, the cheating, Will possibly asking other women to marry him before Kate, those stories had been buried by the press to create a love story that we know now was and still is very romanticized. To an 18-year-old who desperately needed a distraction from college, a 28-year-old put-together woman who was marrying into the royal family seemed pretty cool. At that time, Kate seemed like kind of a rock star. The wedding was different than anything an American teenager had ever seen. Excuse the garbage truck in the back. And again, everything not so nice had been smoothed over by the press in order to introduce this perfect couple as a kind of salve to all the royal family's issues. I didn't go outside of Tumblr for my royal news, and the space that was forming on Tumblr, while not as strict as it would eventually become, was already very pro-Cambridge. So anything I was seeing at that time was double filtered, first by the press, then by Cambridge stands on Tumblr. Looking back now as a 29-year-old myself, things are different. I remember we used to fawn over the fact that William had given Kate his mom's ring. Now, that seems very strange. Why give the love of your life something that represents a failed and miserable marriage? But I digress. Like I said before, this Tumblr space reached its peak in the year after the wedding, and seemed to be. Most accounts were anonymous. I can't actually remember a single user using more than their first name. Was filled with mostly women who seemed to be about my age at the time, if not a little older, so late teens, early to mid-20s. There were a handful of accounts that claimed to be older, and they would become kind of like leaders in the community. Like Twitter, there were people who were there casually, and there were people who invested a lot of time. In the beginning, like 2011, 2012, the early part, the space was very positive, mostly commenting on what Kate was wearing. I was pretty active, not to the degree I am on Twitter, but there was a point where you could show me a photo of Kate and I could have told you where she was on that day. You hear me focus on Kate because I was never really interested in William, and I would argue most of the Tumblr content focused on her. Back then, even in Cambridge land, people would admit William is boring. Things started to change at the end of 2012 when George was announced, both on Tumblr and for me personally. At that point, I'd entered my 20s and had started nursing school. Frankly, I had less time for Tumblr and became much more of a lurker rather than actively participating. As far as Tumblr itself, the group had shrank pretty significantly through 2012. So you might be asking, because most of us are here for the Sussex Squad, what the heck was going on with Harry during this time? And to be frank, I don't really know. The space I was on was very Cambridge focused. I remember brief moments of some of Harry's more party prince moments. And of course, Harry would become more involved in the Tumblr space as that weird third wheel / threesome angle between Will, Kate, and Harry came more into focus. Harry definitely had his own space on Tumblr, which I never really delved into. At this time, Tumblr was yet to be bought by Yahoo, so things had the potential of being pretty R-rated, and the Harry space was very sexual. Like, aggressively sexual. Lots of usernames like Harry's Girl 69, etc. a lot of fanfic type material, which I am not really into, so to be honest, I mostly avoided it. So what happened to this positive Cambridge community on Tumblr? And that's honestly not a super easy question to answer, but I'm going to give it my best shot. So again, we are looking at about the end-ish of 2012. The community has shrank quite a bit, but is arguably still pretty large. It had filtered through that there was some displeasure at how William and Kate's engagement numbers were low, but like the Cambridge Twitter of today, excuses abounded. I remember the first thing that really rocked the boat was it being reported that despite Kate having severe morning sickness and saying she was too sick to continue on royal engagements, they still jetted off to Mystique on vacation. For me personally, I was like, oh wow, that's not a good look. I remember the grumbles about engagement numbers really started getting sharper, with some arguments breaking out in comment sections about the decision to try and sneak off on vacation. But at that point, those arguments were pretty quickly shut down by those older leaders I was referring to previously. The thing that I remember kind of fracturing the community, or at least it was the first really big blow-up, and you need to know that Tumblr is not like Twitter. All of this is contained in the comments of one post instead of fractured under different tweets and users. The thing that really seemed to change things was a makeup post. You know how things on social media can get kind of out of hand over stupid things? Well, somehow a makeup post changed this community forever. Anyway, a very active member of the community commented under a much smaller user's post about how Kate's eyeliner and blush is often heavily applied. It's a fairly common critique, and I don't remember exactly how the original post was phrased, but it was far from a nuclear attack. Because this very active person had commented, this post was now all over the community, and people were pissed. It actually, at first, seemed pretty split down the middle between people being angry someone would talk about Kate's makeup, and people who were then angry that other people were angry that someone had dared post a mild critique of Kate Middleton. Notably, but perhaps not surprisingly, the older leader-type accounts were taking a very pro-Kate stance and being pretty aggressive about it. I don't remember when exactly this post happened. I know Kate was pregnant with George, so at this point this community and many of its members had been talking with each other practically daily for like 2-ish years. I can remember sitting on my couch and refreshing this post over and over to see more comments, and in my opinion, this post was the start of the end for the happy Cambridge community on Tumblr. Almost as a protest against perceived censorship on certain hashtags, all of a sudden Tumblr was inundated with negative Cambridge stories. Notably, the Harry stans all of a sudden got involved when there were stories about Harry being in love with Kate, and God, if you think the squad is intense, let's just say there were a lot of tight-ass Cambridge stans that got a wake-up call when Harry's crew came over. For me, things were again changing. Commenting on Kate's clothes was no longer really interesting. I mean, how many coat dresses can you honestly claim to give a shit about? I was growing as a person and no longer idolized a woman who had been given this amazing platform but had made the choice to do absolutely nothing with it. So, at this point, George is here, and his birth had brought kind of a reprieve on Tumblr. People weren't openly fighting. The community had gotten a lot smaller. I was no longer posting myself or commenting, but just kind of lurking and scrolling through pictures. You could send direct messages in Tumblr too, and I remember getting a lot of negative Cambridge news through DMs, like, secretly. Because in the public space, the almost fanatical leaders would literally send people to attack you if you were even mildly critical. So a space that was originally happy and positive, mostly commenting on Kate's attire, had become a heavily moderated, angry place. Then one day I got kind of brave, mostly because I think I had been drinking, and I made a post right after they announced Kate was going on maternity leave with Charlotte, you know, after being out for the first few months of her pregnancy with HG. Basically, I asked, what exactly was she taking a leave from? Semi-monthly engagements? And, oh boy. See, at this point, even though I had been lurking for some time, I still had a good amount of followers, and I knew how to use the right hashtags. Let's just say the comments ranged from asking me to turn in my ovaries because I obviously don't support other women, and I even got a DM telling me to, off myself, so that was nice. See, my mom worked when I was a kid, and already on Tumblr, the main excuse for Kate not working basically entailed calling women who do work bad mothers. And I think that is pretty classist and shitty. I want to point out that even before Meghan Markle, Kate Middleton, best mom ever, was already becoming a call to action for her fans. I guess as an 18-year-old, I had put Kate on a pedestal for having a good blowout and marrying a prince, which is very embarrassing to me now. But as a young woman in my early 20s, this post and the resulting attacks were pretty much the last straw for me. I stopped even lurking. So at this point, years go by. I'm not really following Cambridge news on anything. I did log back in when Louis was born, and sometimes would lurk after a tour, but let's face it, there weren't many of those, and things were pretty much the same. The same handful of accounts from 2011 controlling the narrative with iron fists. I had a Twitter account I used for politics, but things would filter through when they were trending, but I mostly was not paying attention to the royals. Then I saw Meghan. Now, we share a name, so already my interest was a little piqued. My mom texted me something along the lines of, "Harry's with the Meghan." I had no knowledge of Meghan Markle before Harry. I never watched Suits. The minute I saw her, I knew things were going to be bad. So, because sometimes I hate myself, I logged back onto Tumblr. And I wasn't wrong. The first thing that struck me was how small the community had gotten. The likes under each post were like less than a quarter of what would have been expected during the heyday of the community. The second thing I noticed was the extreme racism. The same assholes who had been trying to shame working mothers were now up in arms over Meghan. There was use of the N-word, censored of course, remember Yahoo has now bought Tumblr, but it was still there in all of its hatefulness. There were inappropriate photos. The craziest thing is that the Harry stands had joined forces with the Cambridge community. Remember a while back how I was talking about the two parties basically going to war with each other over rumors that Kate and Harry were a thing? Well, now they had a common enemy, I guess, because like the rest of the world, we could tell that Harry was serious about Meghan. I logged off for the last time. So, there you have it. A story about how a pro-Cambridge Tumblr community became a hateful, angry place as they attempted to defend Will and Kate. Even before Meghan, in that little microcosm of the world, their fans had become less in number, and those who had remained had become aggressive and intolerant of even mild criticism. This would of course worsen with the introduction of a mixed-race American who did the job better than they ever could or would.